Topic up for discussion is, are Canadian military taking claims of white supremacists among their ranks seriously enough? With more on this, let's go to Bernie Farber. He is with the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. Hi, Bernie.
Good morning, Elias. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, it's a real pleasure to have you on. First off, let's break this down. What kind of numbers do we have when it comes to the Canadian military and, evidence of white supremacists that are within their ranks? What do we know?
So let's start with the evidence. The evidence is by the Canadian military themselves. The Canadian Military Intelligence Branch did a study last year, was released, only through Freedom of Information just about 3 weeks ago. And they determined that between 2013 and 2018, there were over 50 active members of hard right, neo-Nazi, white supremacist hate groups in the Canadian military. Mm-hmm. Now, as of present day, they say that many of these people have left. There still remains 33 active members of some of the most dangerous hate groups probably in the world. Now, according to the military, they claim that this makes up only 0.1% of the entire Canadian military. Therefore, it's not an active concern, which I think is pretty silly and pretty dangerous thinking.
So expand upon that and why you think it's silly, because that's my initial reaction when I hear 33, and I'm imagining that it's such a small number, and you give us the indication of statistically how small it is. And then I go in and I think about it a little bit more, and I'm thinking about not necessarily the members that are part of the most extreme groups, but I would imagine there must be many, many, many more members that are sort of have, leanings towards that, right? Is that the bigger issue?
If they're identifying 33 active members, and by their own count they say there must be many more, but let's understand, it doesn't take 30, it doesn't take 50, it doesn't even take 10. It takes one trained person to create horror. And I give the example really of Timothy McVeigh, and your listeners may not recall, but historically Timothy McVeigh was a white supremacist who planted a bomb at the Alfred J.P. Murrah building in Oklahoma City in 1995. Because of his animosity and his animus towards the American government. That bomb exploded. It killed 168 people, and amongst them 19 children in a daycare center that was adjoined to the building itself. That's what it took. One person was training. Now we know that at least 33 of the most dangerous. Who are the groups we're talking about? The Atomwaffen Division. This is listed as a domestic terrorist group in the United States. They've committed murder. Here in Quebec, La Mouette, we all know about them, and we all know about where they're coming from. Hammerskins Nation, a violent neo-Nazi organization. Soldiers of Odin, also with roots in the neo-Nazi white supremacy business. And of course, Proud Boys. All of these groups are dangerous, and if one of them is trained in the use of arms, if one of them is trained in the use of explosives, only one is needed to cause terrible danger, and we've already seen this happen once here in Quebec. We've seen it happen, of course, in the United States in houses of worship, and we've seen it happen in churches and all over. So this is a serious issue that the military is, in my view, sloughing off.
So you believe that the biggest threat in all of this is that, that sort of possibility of a lone wolf attack by someone who's highly trained through the Canadian military. That is a much, I don't want to sort of argue which is worse, but you take that and you view it as a much more grave threat than what can happen when sort of racist, hateful views get pervasive in the military?
Absolutely. I mean, we know that that's an issue, racist, pervasive views in the military, but can you imagine if you're a racist with these pervasive views and also have the training necessary to take action on your racism? What we're seeing in 2019 is a real shift from what we've seen even a decade ago. It used to be hateful words. We used to see swastikas in synagogues. Now they're walking into our houses of worship and murdering us. That's huge. When it happened in St. Foy, Quebec, many of us couldn't believe it. Well, we better believe it, because then, if literally a year later, it happened in Pittsburgh, where a person with some military training walked into a synagogue, the Tree of Life, and murdered 11 Jews. And then, of course, just shortly thereafter, the Christchurch in New Zealand, where 50 Muslims were murdered. This is something that has now become, sadly, almost the new normal. Do we want our Canadian Armed Forces training these people? Now, Elias, I have to tell you, we did send an official letter to the Minister of Defense, Minister Sajjan. We sent a copy of that to the Chief of the Defense Staff, Charles Vance. We haven't heard anything other than on public media where they say, quote, we're looking into this.
So
not good enough.
I'm so surprised with that because Canada's defense minister is a soldier, a decorated soldier. And by the way, he's also a Sikh, right? So he must have seen it and experienced it firsthand, the kind of racism in the armed forces, I would imagine. So,
well, I would imagine as well, and that's why this is so baffling. Imagine also this for a moment. If the report had come out and said there are 33 active members of ISIS in the Canadian Armed Forces, how long do you think it would be before those people are outrightly dismissed from service?
Yeah, you make the point right there. Because part of me is like, it's dismissive. But when I was talking about this in the office the other day, some of us were looking at this situation and go, well, it's the military. Who else are you going to attract sometimes, right? And some people discount it because of that. But when you put it in that perspective, if this was ISIS, we wouldn't stand for it for a second. No. So why do we stand for it for white supremacists?
And that's a real question. And bearing in mind that there have been, the odd ISIS attack here, which is horrible and terrible, but the majority of Canadians and Americans murdered in terrorist attacks on this continent have come from the extreme right. Yeah. And yet we close our eyes. God forbid there's another attack and we find out that this person was trained in the Canadian military. Of course, everybody will just go bananas. Yeah. But the fact is we now know. And, besides the Canadian Anti-Hate Network and a couple of others who are of like mind, we haven't heard anything. That's why I very much appreciate this interview, because the word has to get out. Bernie, this is something we need to take seriously.
Bernie, I don't have too much time, but I'd be remiss not to mention the fact that, we go through the statistics. The Canadian military, we got to point out that they are made, primarily of some really upstanding, great people, right? So
I have great respect for the Canadian military.
But that's where the chain's going to have to come from, right? Is that overwhelming majority part of the Canadian military?
Leaders have to lead, and right now the leaders of the Canadian military are far from leading. They're closing their eyes. That has to change.
Bernie Farber is with the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. Thanks for taking the time, Bernie.
Thanks, Elias. Take care.